Hi, and welcome in our next video on semantics and pragmatics. This week we are going to talk about politeness. In this video we are going to close our block on pragmatics before we move on to other aspects of meaning. First, we are going to talk about politeness and the so-called face management. Later on, we are also going to talk about so-called politeness maxims. Okay, so what is face management, and more importantly, what is face? So when we talk about face in the framework of the modern politeness theory, that is based on the 1987 book by Penelope Brown and Stephen Levinson, we mean the public self-image of a person. The emotional and social sense of self that everybody has and that everyone also wants everyone else to recognize. And when we talk about politeness or impoliteness, about polite and impolite words, expressions, speech acts, and so forth, we mean the acts that either show awareness of another person's face or don't show awareness for another person's face, or even threaten another person's face. Right? So when someone wants to talk to Mr. Buckingham, there are basically two different approaches. Well, there are more approaches, but for the sake of simplicity, let's discuss these two examples. We can either address Mr. Buckingham as follows. Excuse me, Mr. Buckingham, but can I talk to you for a minute? Right? Or I can say something like this. Hey, Bucky, got a minute? And you intuitively see that the first sentence is more polite than the other one. But of course, politeness always depends on the relative social distance or closeness of the two interlocutors. So if I do not know Mr. Buckingham, then the second sentence, hey Bucky, got a minute, would be very impolite, and the first one would be the only appropriate one. However, if, for example, I am an old friend with Mr. Buckingham, then saying the first one would be odd and the second one would be the normal one. So it always depends on the social constellation between the interlocutors. Because there are also different face wants, right? So what the face of the person that we're talking to desires, so to speak, metaphorically. Right, so let's have a look at face wants. Now, in square brackets here is the situation, the context. It's late night, a young neighbor is playing his music very loudly, and an older couple tries to sleep. Now, person A from the older couple says, I'm going to tell him to stop that awful noise right now. And to answer that, and as an answer to that, the second person then says, I'm going to tell him to stop that awful noise right now, would be a face threatening act, which is an utterance that if person A would really go on with it, go through with it, would be a possible threat to another's face, right? So if person A from the elderly couple would really go to the young neighbor and say, can you stop that awful noise right now? It would be a threat to the face of the young neighbor. That's why the spouse then responds and says, perhaps you could just ask him if he's going to stop soon because it's getting a bit late and people need to get asleep. Right? So that would be the so-called face-saving act, which is an utterance that lessens a possible threat to another's face. Right? So we know that certain expressions, certain things that we ask other persons to do or that we want them to do for us may threaten their public face, right? How they are perceived by others, how they want to be perceived. And if we know something like that is going to happen, we can use certain strategies to mitigate a possible face-saving act. Right. So important to know is that there are also different face types. So we have what is called the positive face. The positive face of a person is what is sometimes also called the please like me and what I do principle. This is the need to be accepted, liked, and to be treated like a member of a group by others. The need to be connected with other people. At the same time, everybody also has the so-called negative face, which is sometimes known as live and let live principle. This is the need of everyone to be independent, to have freedom of action, and not to be imposed by others. So important here is need to be independent, right? And they are in conflict with each other because you can't be independent and connected at the same time. So you, in different situations, either the positive face or the negative face gets highlighted. And this also is reflected in politeness because different politeness strategies are either aimed at a person's negative face or at their positive face. Based on that, we can then distinction between the so-called negative politeness, which is a face-saving act concerned with one's negative face, or positive politeness, which is a face-saving act concerned with one's positive face. Right. And then we have something that's called the off and on record speaking. Right. So imagine the situation. Person A is searching through their bag in front of person B, and they are unable to find a pen. And then you're searching through the bag and then say something like, I seem to have forgotten my pen, or I wonder where I put my pen. This would be off record. You're not directly addressing anyone, you're just sort of mumbling to yourself, and this can either be really sort of talking to yourself, or it can be an indirect address to somebody, right? So if you know that there is someone standing next to you and you say repeatedly, oh, I forgot my pen, oh, where could I have put my pen, and so forth, you perhaps hope that the other person will react to this. If you, however, realize that you've lost your pen or you can't find it and you need one, and ask the other person standing next to you something like, give me a pen, lend me your pen, this would be a direct address to the interlocutor. This would be speaking on record, right? And now if we try to sort of play this scenario, right? We are looking for a pen and we don't have a pen, right? And we have the possibility to either say nothing and simply search in our bag whether we don't find it on our own, or we can say something. And if we say something, we can either, as we've just seen, either say something off record, so something like, oh, I must have forgotten my pen, silly me, or you can then speak on record. And you can either be so-called bold on record and be direct. Say something like, give me a pen, I need a pen. But this is a potential face-threatening act, right? Because people don't want to be asked in such a direct manner. That's why you also have the possibility to use a face-saving strategy. And then either aim at the positive face or negative face of the person, right? So positive politeness strategy would then be something like, if you lend me a pen, I'll pay for lunch, or I'll invite you for a lunch or for a dinner or something like that. Right? So and the other thing, negative politeness, would be something like asking, oh, you couldn't possibly lend me a pen, could you? If you remember what we've talked about when we talked about politeness and negative and politeness, negative and positive politeness, and negative and positive face, right? So we have the distinction between positive face need to be accepted, liked, treated like a member of the same group. Please like me and like what I do. And then there is the negative face, live and let live, need to be independent, don't be imposed by others, don't have your freedom of action restricted, and so forth. Right? And that's why you have these two different strategies, right? If you lend me a pen, I'll pay for your lunch. You offer something to that person, right? That's nice. Or negative politeness in this case, you couldn't possibly lend me a pen, could you? In that strategy, you don't ask someone to do something for you, but you sort of let the other person decide, at least verbally, right? Because they still have the option to say, no, I can't, I don't have, sorry. Which is more difficult if you ask someone, give me a pen. Okay, now let's have a look at politeness maxims. Politeness maxims, based around the politeness principle, were first formulated in the 1983 Principles of Pragmatics book by Jeffrey Leach. And what this politeness principle and politeness maxims basically say, actually in parallel to conversation maxims that we talked about last week, they say that speakers choose expressions that minimally belittle the hearer's status, right? And by belittling the hearer's status, we mean things like treating them as subservient, saying bad things about our interlocutor, or expressing pleasures at their misfortunes, disagreeing with them, and praising ourselves, right? So those are things that we try not to do in our conversations. And again, we use positive and negative politeness to achieve that. In positive politeness, as we've just seen, we emphasize the hearer's positive status, right? So we say something like, thank you, that was extremely helpful. When using negative politeness, we mitigate or try to eliminate the effect of belittling expressions such as those listed above, because those are sometimes inevitable, but we can mitigate their effects, right? So we can ask, you couldn't possibly give me a hand with this piano, could you? Okay. So when we talk about politeness maxims, there are different types of politeness maxims, and one group of these maxims are centered around the cost benefit for the speaker or hearer, right? So there is the Tact maxim, which tries to either minimize or maximize the cost benefit to the hearer. There is the Generosity maxim, which has to do with the benefit or cost to the speaker. And then we have politeness maxims that have to do with the expression of positive and negative opinions. The Praise maxim, minimize dispraise to the hearer and maximize praise of the hearer. And the modesty maxim: minimize praise of oneself and maximize dispraise of oneself. Right. So let's have a look at the tact maxim. Here we have from 1 to 6 a series of impositives, so-called impositives. So commands, requests, beseechments, and so forth. Something that we want from others. And the greater the cost for the hearer is, right? And here you can say that from the 1 is the most, there is the biggest cost for the hearer, while number 6 has basically no cost for the hearer. But the higher the cost for the hearer, the more polite formulation we need, right? So if we say something like wash the dishes, that's rather impolite, but we can say things like, could you wash the dishes? Or I was wondering if you could possibly wash the dishes. And if we say something, if we try to say something like this, something very polite in, for example, in 6, I was wondering if you could possibly enjoy your holiday. This is rather weird. And if we say something like that, then we are probably trying to say something else. And it's not a request. But that's another topic. Okay, then we have the generosity maxim. Right, so this is parallel to the tact maxim, only the effect is reversed, right? So it's not oriented at the hearer, but at the speaker, right? So you try to look generous, or you try to offer yourself to others. So let me wash the dishes instead of wash the dishes. Well, I was wondering if I could possibly wash the dishes, right? A polite question to do something for yourself. Or you have here, I want to borrow your car, or could I possibly borrow your car? Okay, so praise maxim. Again, fairly straightforward. Minimize dispraise of the hearer and maximize praise of the hearer. Right, so if someone asks you, do you like my dress? Then by answering no, you are acting against this praise maxim. Because you are maximizing basically dispraise of the hero. Or you can say something like, well, yes, but it's not my favorite, which basically says the same thing, but you're saying that you're not saying directly that you don't like it, but you say that it's simply not your favorite, that there are others, other dresses that are prettier. Okay. Or we can, if we say something like, oh, I've been so thoughtless, the other person can either react by saying, oh, not at all, think nothing of it. Right? That's the normal thing that we would expect. The impolite thing to say would be, oh, yes, haven't you? Right? And because that would be impolite, because by saying something like that, we again maximize dispraise of the hearer instead of mitigating the negative effect. Right? Or if you're invited somewhere, you say things like, oh, thank you so much for inviting us. We had an absolutely wonderful time, right? Where you maximize praise of the hearer. Okay, so modesty maxim. Again, maximize dispraise of oneself and minimize praise of yourself, right? So you should not praise yourself too much, basically. So someone tells you, oh, you did brilliantly. And then again, saying something like, yes, didn't I? Is sort of maximizing praise of yourself, which is something that goes against this maxim, which people don't always like to hear. Or if you say, that's why you should say something like, well, I thought I didn't do too badly, which doesn't really boast. It's not boasting, right? Okay. right? And if in some occasions, in some situations, right, this is obviously an absurd situation, but you could possibly, if you say something like, "Oh, Your Majesty, I am a mere worm, a disgusting toad, and I deserve no forgiveness. I throw myself at Your Majesty's feet." Right? Where you have an extreme case where you maximize dispraise of yourself. You're a disgusting toad and deserve no forgiveness, while and at the same time minimize praise of yourself. Right? There is nothing positive about the speaker. Okay. So politeness maxims also have the so-called agreement maxim, where you try to agree with the hearer as possible and avoid disagreement. You have also the sympathy maxim, which maximizes sympathy towards the hearer and minimizes antipathy. And also the consideration maxim, where you try to minimize the hearer's discomfort, displeasure, and maximize that comfort, pleasure, right? So it's always minimize the negative effects and maximize the positive effects, right? Agreement maxim, again, right? So if someone's late and the boss or someone who has the power to decide that says something like, "Oh, she should be sacked immediately. We can't tolerate unpunctuality," right? And you think, "Oh, this is perhaps a bit too harsh." You can either say something like, "Oh, I disagree," or "This is complete bollocks." Or this would be maximizing disagreement, right? Showing very clearly that you don't disagree, that you don't agree with someone. Or you can sort of follow the agreement maxim and say something like, "Oh, I agree with the general principle. Yes, we should not tolerate unpunctuality, but in this case, there are perhaps mitigating circumstances that we should consider," and so forth, right? Where you maximize agreement as possible, even though you show that you disagree. Right, then we have the sympathy and consideration maxims, right, where you, for example, this tells you that, when you say that you're sorry about someone's loss, you try to omit the topic, right? It has to do with taboos, so sensitive topics. So instead of saying something like, "I was sorry to hear about your husband," and what it was that happened to the husband is here left unsaid, this is preferred normally, and saying things like, "Oh, I was sorry to hear about your husband's death," would be the less preferred version. And even less preferred version would be something like, "Oh, I was sorry to hear that your husband was hit by a car and he suffered terribly." This would be completely unacceptable. On the other hand, when it's something positive, right, we want to maximize the hearer's comfort, right? Or we want to praise the hearer as possible, as much as possible. And that's why we would here say something like, "That was great news about Jennifer's Oscar, wasn't it?" Right? When we say that, okay, what is it that happened to Jennifer? That she won an Oscar. In that situation, saying something like, "Oh, that was great news about Jennifer," this would seem probably a bit weird, but again, depends on the situation, because it looks like you're trying to omit the topic that is actually a good one, which is something that normally people want to highlight, right? Okay, so to sum up, when we talk about the politeness principle, there is a series of maxims that always try to maximize the positive side effect of whatever we're saying, and at the same time minimize the negative side effects. And we've been talking about a number of them, so tact maxims, the generosity maxim, the praise maxim, the modesty maxim, the agreement maxim, sympathy maxim, and consideration maxim. Theoretically, politeness maxims are culturally unbound, so they are not tied to a specific culture, and they should be applicable to every language community, at least according to Jeffrey Leach. And they should, the different societies where we do see different behavior, different approaches to what seems polite and impolite, are simply due to the fact that different language communities put emphasis on different maxims, right? So some societies might be more inclined to maximize modesty, while others would not do that. So the theory of politeness maxims is very universalistic in this regard. Okay, so now a summary of the whole thing that we learned today. So we talked about the modern politeness theory and about about politeness maxims. And those are two things that are, those are things based on two groundbreaking books. The first one, Politeness, Some Universals in Language Usage by Brown and Levinson, and Principles of Pragmatics by Jeffrey Leach. The important things here are that we can distinguish between the so-called positive and the negative face, right? The need of the speakers to look positively and to be liked, while at the same time to be independent from other members of the community. Based on this distinction, we then have the so-called face-saving acts, which try to mitigate or minimize the negative effects, effects of whatever we are saying for the faces of our interlocutors. And we have face-threatening acts, which are the opposite, things that we say that at least have the potential to threaten the face of our interlocutor. And again, based on that, we can distinguish between positive and negative politeness, whether we use face-saving acts that to aim at someone's positive or at someone's negative face. And when we do these things, right, so these positive politeness and negative politeness and face-saving acts and face-threatening acts, those are things that we do based on a number of maxims. And these maxims being simply general principles that the conversations that we are involved in work by, are the politeness maxims that we've been talking about the last couple of minutes: tact, generosity, praise, modesty, agreement, sympathy, consideration. Okay, that was it for today. Thank you for watching, and see you in our live session. Bye.